Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. And I think we're ready to roll now. I'm here. You know who is here. You'll hear him periodically. He snores louder and louder, it seems. Shabbat Shalom. And I know we're on another week of virtual lockdown, depending on what we do. But the upside of that is we've got plenty of time to study the Word. We've got plenty of time for prayer. And I want to bring you again the Torah portion this week, but I also want to keep pulling those threads of Ezekiel and his prophecy about the 10th of Tevet, the siege of Jerusalem that began then. And I want to add a little bit of speculation. Don't write it down. Don't say I set a date. Don't say anything like that. But I do want to give you a paradigm from that prophecy. And if we look at that paradigm, you're going to see that there's maybe an intentional ambiguity in that prophecy. Not necessarily in the prophecy itself, but in the chronicles of it in 2 Kings that speaks about the siege of Jerusalem and what happens on what date. And I think if we look at those dates going back to the 7th of January of this year, which was the 10th of Tevet on the Hebrew calendar, and we just project out from that date certain dates that would coincide with the siege of Jerusalem and Ezekiel's prophecy, we might have some dates to watch for in the future. And that intentional ambiguity, I think it's intentional. I mean, it is ambiguous because you can read it this way and it's this many months, and you can read it that way and it's that many months. But we'll look at it either way, because either way we look at it, the dates that it falls down on as we project out from the 7th of January or the 10th of Tevet 2020, both of those dates, whether you're calculating out 18 months or whether you're calculating out the 30 months, they're very significant dates in terms of the history of Israel. So hopefully we'll have some time to do that. But before we get to that point, before we start looking at the more prophetic aspect of it, we need to look at this week's Torah portion, because everything is established on the Torah portion. In fact, there's going to be a repetition. If we do start projecting out those dates from the 10th of Tevet, you're going to see a repetition of the Torah portion, Balak. And if you don't know what the Torah portions are, I'll type that in the chat box there for you. Balak, you can look that up. And you can read that Torah portion. And there's a great resource out there if you are unfamiliar with the Torah portions and you don't really know what I'm talking about when I say that, or when I say the word parashah. There's a great website called Hebrew for Christians, and there's a link where you can get in there, and it has a chronological list of the Torah portion readings with their corresponding readings from the prophets, and then a suggested reading from the New Testament, so that you can see that continuity there. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on what your time zone is. It's good to kind of see everyone. You can see me, I can't see you. That's a little annoying. I'd love to see everybody. At any rate, let's go to the Torah portion, which this week is Shmini, which means 8th. And even if you don't know what a Torah portion is right now, you have to know that's important. When you hear the word 8th in Scripture, you know that the numbers in Scripture, they mean things. So you don't even have to understand everything about numbers in Scripture to know that the number 3 represents resurrection. It's new life. So you already have kind of a working knowledge. But we can make it more specific. And right now, maybe the only thing you're associating with the 8th day is the circumcision, which, yes, it's important. And I think you're going to see the circumcision as we go through the lesson, that the circumcision of the heart, the circumcision of the spirit, and what that actually symbolizes. Because I don't know that traditionally we have looked at a circumcision of the heart as something connected to the book of Leviticus. We tend to think of Leviticus as, oh my goodness, these bone dry rules and regulations and all these dead sacrifices and the blood spatters. And hey, it's more exciting than you think. In fact, I think, each book of the Bible we get to, I say that's my favorite book, but I think Leviticus pretty well tops out there. But your readings, if you want to have your Bible open and just kind of scan through the contents of Shmini, which means eighth, it's going to be Leviticus 9:1 through 11:47. Leviticus 9:1 through 11:47. And then you're reading from the prophets, which is going to be very specific, by the way. 2 Samuel 6:1 through 7:17. If we can understand what happened to Nadab in the Torah portion, then we can understand what happens to Uzzah when they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem. And they're having this great praise and worship service. And all of a sudden, this wonderful, ecstatic praise and worship service is interrupted by heavenly fire and a sudden death. And we say, well, how could it possibly be that we would be praising and worship and having this wonderful feeling of the Spirit coming down? Well, that's just the message. We need to be really careful when we go into these realms of holiness, that in the midst of our ecstasy, that we're not also caught up in disobedience, because those two things don't go together. We're going to look at this as a pattern and as an example. The Psalm for the week is 128. And if I had to pick one Brit Chadashah portion, it would be the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 10, the complete chapter. The whole book of Hebrews, actually. But chapter 10, I think, is going to be very specific to our topics. And what I like to tell people is, if you want to understand what you're reading in the New Testament, in the Brit Chadashah, then you need that wonderful ease of reading the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of the Torah, because you can key back and forth topically or thematically, we might say. Whatever you're reading in the Newer Testament, it has its basis in the first 5 books of the Bible in the Torah. Now, the prophets will expand upon it and expound upon it. Good to see you guys, Colleen. Like to see South Africa on there. It's probably late for you guys right now. But if you want to do this comparison, I would invite you, and please don't go buy this book on Shabbat. All right, I do want to show it to you though, because I've gotten a lot of email and messages this week. And this isn't even a good copy. This is a bad copy. But you can see the title of it, The 7 Abominations of the Wicked Lamp. But the reason I'm showing it to you, because I've gotten questions about these Torah portions these weeks. Some of you are not familiar with them. In the back of this workbook is something I always encourage my students to do. And I actually did it for you. In the appendix, I have a list of all the Torah portions where you can find them. And I have room here for you to make bullet points on each of these Torah portions, and just to summarize the contents of that Torah portion. Because if I were going to summarize Shmini, this week's Torah portion, which means 8th, I would summarize it as the glory. The dietary laws are in there, the requirements of holiness, and the theme of the 8th, because that's how it starts out, the 8th day. That's why it's named 8th. That usually the title of the Torah portion has something to do with the first sentence. And so that's what this portion does. Once you've got this full set, once you've taken a year and filled it in, now you've got bullet points for all of the Torah portions. So when you run across, let's say, the 8th day, you run across something about the 8th day, maybe somewhere in Acts 7:8 or Luke chapter 1. You say, wait a minute, I have context for what I'm reading here. Let me go back and refresh my memory in that Torah portion, and then it'll help me understand what I'm reading. I want to understand dietary laws, for instance, then if I'm reading in Acts 10:1 through 11:18, which is all about Peter's vision and how he's explaining it as it pertains to the Gentiles. I say, well, where's the context for that? What exactly is that talking about? Then I can go back to the Torah portion, Shmini, and it will tell me about the dietary laws and what's important for me to know about the dietary laws. And in fact, if you'd like more information on the dietary laws, there's a great Becky book out there, and it's entitled Peter's Vision, Beacon or Bacon? Okay, I'll type the name of the series in there, and you can look for it, Becky Books. Beacon or Bacon. If you're not real clear on those dietary laws, it's a great read, and it's easy to read. So that's just an overview of how you would go through there. So let's go to Leviticus 9:22. Let's take a look at this idea of holiness. That says, then Aaron lifted up his hands toward the people and blessed them. And he stepped down after making the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offerings. Now that's key. There's a chronology here. 3 things happened. We have a sin offering, we have a burnt offering, and we have a peace offering. 3 different types of offerings. And by the way, each of those offerings represents some aspect of our faith, how we're walking in our faith. So once those offerings are offered first, it says, Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. When they came out and blessed the people, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Then the fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. So we have the fire coming out. We have the glory coming out. And if you think about it, this is what modern praise and worship services are all about. People want to see the glory. They want to feel the fire. They want to feel the spiritual ecstasy. We're not saying that's wrong because we've got a precedent for it. But if we read it as exactly as it's written, we've got to admit that before we get the glory, before we get the fire, we're going to have to address our sin. We're going to have to address the burnt offering or the resurrection offering, the lifted up offering, and the peace offerings, right? That's why it's important to study Leviticus, to understand everything that those represent, because they teach us about our daily walk with Messiah. And when those things are addressed, then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Then the fire came out. And we're going to read what happens when you try to rush into that glory and you have not properly addressed the things that need to be done beforehand. Now, I'm going to back up just a little bit. I'm not going to go through this whole lesson because it is a whole lesson. And it's important for you to know it. It's going back to the Torah portion, Kitisa, which again is about the tabernacle. And in that lesson, I take you through 7 points. And in those 7 points, what you realize is that the first day of creation, corresponds to when the tabernacle was erected. They both occurred in the first of the first month. And then as you take those 7, we call them makings or doings. It's based on the Hebrew verb asa. The makings or the doings. So for the 7 makings or the doings, and we're talking about a specific text, we're not talking about in general, but we're specifically using those words. In Genesis 1, then we can look over at how the tabernacle, the Mishkan, was built, and it corresponds to those 7 makings. So what Elohim made on the 7 days of creation, you also see the human beings making as they make the Mishkan. And in that lesson, we talk about how he presented humankind with an opportunity to at least take that preliminary step back into the garden, to try to recapture something that was lost when we were kicked out of the garden. So we're going to kind of skip through that. And where do we want to go from there? Once we had established that, let's say we went through that whole lesson of the 7 makings corresponding to one another. What that would bring us to in terms of the tabernacle is where we are this week, Shmini, the 8th day. And that's what it leads to. When we have the 7 days of creation, well, what comes after 7? 8. Last time, I'm not real good at math, but I'm pretty sure 8 comes after 7. So in the same way with the Mishkan, they had 7 days of inauguration, 7 days of preparation for what was going to happen next. But it's not until the 8th day that the fire falls and the glory comes down. So what precedes? The creation of the universe, the building of the sanctuary, right? Okay, now we arrive at a Torah portion that somehow sees the dietary laws and the number 8 as part of that whole theme. It's tying these additional ideas in there. And maybe there was also always a proto-prophecy embedded within those first 7. And that's what we want to look at. Now, remember, last week we talked about how this COVID-19, we went back on the World Health Organization's log. It's a public document. And we saw where the COVID-19 virus was isolated on January 7th, which is the 10th of Tevet, a significant day on the Hebrew calendar. And it's also interesting, no matter what the truth is, at this point, I'm not sure the truth really matters, that what matters is people are sick and people are dying. And that, the whole world's kind of in an upside down state right now. But whether they were actually using these wet markets, which is where the virus was contracted, whether they were actually doing it on purpose in a lab, at this point, it's irrelevant. You're sick. But knowing that this is the language surrounding the virus, we realize that one of the 4 altar judgments, at least one of the 4 altar judgments, and remember, the 4 altar judgments come from fire. Remember, there's 4 horns on the altar, there's 4 sides on the altar, and there are 4 altar judgments that Moses prophesies about, and then those 4 altar judgments are mentioned throughout the prophets and throughout the New Testament, especially in the book of Revelation. And if you don't remember them, remember they are famine, which means hunger, plague, which can include like a sickness like we have right now, like a pestilence, the sword, which can mean war, lack of peace, rebellions, uprisings, controversy, but it also means the sword literally in Hebrew means to make thirsty. And then the 4th one, which I think is we can associate with this coronavirus, or if we look back at the previous viruses that have gone out, previous pestilences and so forth, you can see that there's overlap. It's rarely one of these altar judgments at work. It's typically a combination of them. So what we might see as a plague might also be the work of a wild beast. In this case, maybe bats. Who knows? From all the blood exchanges and how the blood of these animals has not been treated the way that the book of Leviticus tells us to treat the blood, even of animals, then it shouldn't be surprising that we're seeing outbreaks of plague and wild beast. And so those 2 are working together. And at this point, the whole world has been awakened to the dangers of wild beasts, simply because of the articles that are being published about where did this come from. People go wild trying to figure out, was it manufactured? Was it because of the wet markets? Well, we need to know those things so that we can stop it if we can. But ultimately, you can waste a lot of your time chasing articles and news programs about it when maybe the bigger clue is found in Scripture. And once we figure out that these altar judgments do come from the altar above, then maybe we will have more reverence and respect for what is above than we were going to have fear of what is below. Each of those has other manifestations. Like if you look at the 10 plagues of Egypt, they all came out of these 4 altar judgments in some way. And like I say, there's frequently, and there should be overlap. Look for overlap, especially in the realm of domino effect. But again, working together like a plague and a wild beast. You can get a plague from a wild beast. You can even get it from a domestic beast. If you treat even domestic animals, clean animals such as cows, improperly, then you can get something like a mad cow disease. If we're not handling our animals the way that Scripture tells us, then we should expect that eventually there will be consequences. But there's also symbolic meanings. If we look at the plague of wild beasts, Paul gives us some insight. Remember in Acts 19:26, he fights with the craftsmen's guild, the guild members who were making the silver idols of Diana in Ephesus, and he starts cutting in on their business. I would bet you they weren't nearly as invested in faith in Diana as they were faith in the money that they were making by selling the idols of Diana. And so when Paul causes that economy to suffer based on preaching the gospel, then they attack him and the people who are with him. Later, he tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15:32, he tells the Corinthians, I fought with wild beasts at Ephesus. So in this idea of wild beasts, which we might think as wild animals running around attacking us, he says it can be human beings too who are acting with a beast-like nature. And it's a symbol of economic power. When you mess with a certain power structure that's based on economics, and then you have to understand also that military is tied up into that, government is tied up into that, religion can frequently be tied up into those power structures. When you start messing with a power structure where people are losing power and therefore money, then you might arouse the wild beast because it's based on an economic system. You see that reflected in Revelation, where it talks about the mark of the beast and the 666. And if you don't have the mark of the beast, then you can't buy or sell. And that has a much different meaning than most books are telling you, or movies or whatever. Again, if you go back to this workbook, it'll kind of lay that out for you very simply, where you can see there's a foundation for this. Scripture has already covered this information, and it may not even apply to you. That's the good news. If you're watching this, it probably doesn't, I'm going to bet. But at any rate, we can see in Paul's explanation of wild beasts that even the books of Daniel and John's Revelation, they both speak of kingdoms, and those kingdoms are represented by beasts. So when we get to the book of Revelation and we see those kingdoms represented by beasts, then we can see that the one number that does keep popping up is 7. That the judgments are coming in waves of 7s. Everything in Revelation is summarized in 7. Even as you're looking at the judgments, they might come in 3rds or so forth, but the big number is going to be 7. So how do we counteract these kingdoms of wild beasts? How do we counteract the king of Babylon? How do we counteract idolatry? It's going to be with 7. And it's simple. It really is. So let's look at the beasts. Leviticus 11:9, it says, "These you may eat, whatever is in the water, all that have fins and scales." And by the way, if you find something with scales, there's a 99.99999 chance it's also got fins. But the reverse is not true. It can have fins, but it may not have scales. "Those in the water, in the seas, or in the rivers, you may eat. But whatever is in the seas and in the rivers that does not have fins and scales, among all the teeming life of the water, and among all of the living creatures that are in the water, they are detestable things to you, and they shall be abhorrent to you. You may not eat of their flesh, and their carcasses you shall detest. Whatever in the water does not have fins and scales is abhorrent to you." Right? It's talking about to eat. It's not talking about abhorrent in itself because it's a living creature. As long as it's alive, it's not abhorrent. It's fulfilling its ecological function. It's maintaining the dignity of what it was created to do. He says, "These, moreover, you shall detest among the birds. They are abhorrent, not to be eaten: the eagle and the vulture and the buzzard and the kite and the falcon in its kind, every raven in its kind, and the ostrich and the owl and the seagull and the hawk in its kind, and the little owl and the cormorant and the great owl, and the white owl and the pelican and the carrion vulture and the stork, the heron in its kinds, and the hoopoe and the bat." Okay, no bats at all. "All the winged insects that walk on all fours are detestable to you." So there's a list. There's more. It's just, that's one little section of it. But it points out for us the things that are food. If we're in covenant with the Holy One, the things that are food and the things that are not food. And it's giving us easy ways to distinguish what is food and what is not food. And it's making a distinction right here. We know in the garden we ate plants. We didn't eat animals. It's like every herb was given to us. Then we arrive after the flood. Things have changed a lot. And so with the Noahide covenant, we have a minimum threshold set for human civilization. There's very minimal instruction. You don't get this detailed like we just read. I mean, Leviticus 11:9-20, that's detailed. When we get into the instructions to Noah, much less detail. But it's more of an instinctual moral code as it comes to how we deal with one another and how we deal with animals. But it's this minimum level of human morality. And what would we see? Mankind very quickly violates even these just basic tenets of morality. Like one of them, you don't tear the limb from a living animal and eat it. What do people do? That's exactly what they do. You see people throwing these crabs and lobsters into a boiling pot alive. You see them, drinking blood out of a living animal. Well, that was basic, and you couldn't even do that. But we arrive at Sinai. Now he's called the people out of Egypt. He's called them out of the realm of death. And now we get much more details in this code of holiness. He says, okay, I'm going to make a covenant with you as a special people. We got to work on these other people out here drinking blood and, eating creepy things that just aren't good for you spiritually. And so at Sinai, he establishes a higher code in terms of details. Now, I think we said last week, Noah already knew the difference between a clean and an unclean animal, at least in terms of sacrifice. Whether he knew that in terms of what to eat and what not to eat, I don't know that we have that in detail. But he did know the difference already. And there were 7 pairs brought of the clean animals. But at Sinai, we get the long list of instructions that are going to be given to Moses to pass on to the Israelites. And this is why it's important, I think, to see how the parallel structure is within the text of the creation chapter 1 and in the construction of the Mishkan, this glorious Mishkan out in the wilderness. Because whereas there are going to be natural boundaries set into place at the creation, and if those boundaries aren't set in the exact order they're set, then everything collapses. And that's why a lot of people, I like for them to memorize when we're doing workbook 1, memorize what was created on each of the 7 days of creation. Because if you're not sure of the order of things, you might try to place the sun and the moon and the stars on the first day of creation, which is where they should not be. Prior to the sun, the moon, and the stars, which were created on the 4th day, you realize there were plants on the 3rd day. You said, well, how could there be plants if there was no sun? Good question. But there was already light. That's what you need to understand. From the first day, there was a celestial light that the plants could thrive under. And so the sun, the moon, and the stars are only secondary to that idea. And that forces us to think in terms of the spirit as preceding the natural world. That the natural world is not all there is. There was something that preceded it. So we look at this Mishkan, this glorious Mishkan, and we realize, oh man, the precedent for that was way back in Genesis chapter 1. And it's with this Mishkan that we're beginning to learn about the natural order and boundaries that were from the beginning. The things that we lost through sin, the things that we lost through robbery and violence and trying to make ourselves out to be God and building towers and these vain imaginations, all the things that we thought we could and should do. Now this is a chance to put things back into the natural order and to try to say, well, okay, if he's preparing us to go back into the garden, then let me read the document. Let me read this job description here that describes people who are fit to live in the garden. And so Moses teaches them these instructions, and what do? They do the same thing that we did with the Noahide covenant. They violate it. They violate it badly. So let's go to Leviticus 9:1. It says, now it came about on the 8th day, right? So the Mishkan, the tabernacle, has been set up for 7 days in a row. Nothing happens. You can imagine what Aaron and his sons and Moses were feeling like. Well, we're coming out here every day and nothing's happening. We're going through the motions. Nothing's happening. Why isn't anything happening? Where's the glory? Have we been bad again? But it says it came about on the 8th day that Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel, and he said to Aaron, take for yourself a calf, a bull for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering, both without defect, and offer them before the Lord. Then to the sons of Israel you shall speak, saying, take a male goat for a sin offering, and a calf and a lamb, both 1 year old, without defect, for a burnt offering, and an ox and a ram for peace offerings, to sacrifice before the Lord, and a grain offering mixed with oil. Now, oil is Shemin in Hebrew, and 8th is Shmini. So there's a certain anointing that's going to fall on the 8th day. He says, for today the Lord will appear to you. So they took what Moses had commanded to the front of the tent of meeting, and the whole congregation came near and stood before the Lord. Moses said, this is the thing which the Lord has commanded you to do, that the glory of the Lord may appear to you. And that's the secret. You say, well, why aren't we seeing the glory? Or we might feel like we're experiencing the glory, but then it's gone really fast. What's happening? Why can't we experience the glory the same way that they did in the Mishkan, or the same way that they did in the Mikdash, in the temple? Well, Moses just told us why we're not seeing it and experiencing it exactly the same way. He says, this is the thing that the Lord has commanded you to do. There is so little obedience in the world And Moses is saying the glory is conditional upon obedience. Now, notice he's not having a salvation conversation here. They're already saved. That's a given. They're out of Egypt. And maybe that's why we're having such trouble. We're stuck in salvation conversations when Moses is saying, let's get beyond that. Let's get to what the Lord has commanded us to do so that his glory can appear to us. And it can't just be a handful of people. It says all of them. He's going to appear to all of you. What does that tell you? They all need to be obedient if we want to experience the glory. And so it's at the conclusion. Let's take this back to the creation, because we know that they're parallel, or you just have to take my word for it at this point. But you can go back and you can do the word studies. I'm trying to figure out if there was a way I could put the PowerPoints up for you, but I don't know. We'll work on that some other time. At any rate, we go back to the creation and we look at our pattern there. At the conclusion of the sixth day, all the work is done. All the preparation work is done. And it's at that point that it says Elohim rests. And he sets another boundary. Each day had its own boundaries. Each day had its own separation, separating light and darkness, separating water from water, separating the dry land from the earth, separating the seasons and the feast days, the Moedim on the fourth day, separating the water creatures from the air creatures on the fifth day, separating the beast from the man on the sixth day. Each one of those has its separation. By the way, when you see separation language, then you know you're listening to a priestly context. Okay, you can read kingly or royal language. You can read prophetic language, but when you are reading priestly language, you will see a lot of separation words. And so what we see here again is another separation. 6 days, a separation, and then the seventh day is declared holy. There's a boundary set around the seventh day that does not exist around the other 6. It has its own boundary known as holiness. And so what does that tell us? All the work was complete at the end of the 6th day. Nothing was added. On the 7th day, you were simply supposed to rest in what had already been created. The message to Adam: you cannot add to that which is divine. You cannot be the creator. Everything that you have to work with, Adam, is already created. Everything you have to work with, Eve, it's already created. You can't add anything to that work. Your work is going to start on the 8th day. But so that you never mistake yourself for that which is divine, so that you never mistake your will, which is not holy, with my will, which is holy, I'm setting these things in place so that you can't begin your work until the 8th day, because there's always going to be a difference between divine creativity and human creativity. And the message to Adam and Eve is, I want you to guard this boundary. You're going to have to know what the difference is between my creation and your creation, what you can do with that. And that was the problem that kept cropping up. I mean, especially as we go back to Babylon, there's going to be this sense of we can be divine, that we can build this tower and so forth. And so what do? They confuse the boundary. He says, never confuse yourself. You're in my image, but you are not me. Huge difference. One little boundary, huge difference. And so when we rest on the Sabbath, the message that we are telling the world, we are reminding the world not to confuse its work with being God, not to confuse human creativity with Elohim's creativity. They are not the same. All we could ever do is build on and let him teach us how to build on that which he had already established. And the way that he set that up so that we would never confuse it is so we would understand that our mission does not begin until the 8th day. Our work does not begin until the 8th day. Adam's created, the 7th day comes in, it's sanctified, it's holy. All Adam can do is rest. If Adam starts trying to work on the 7th day, he's trying to add to the work of the Creator. And that's, time after time, especially Paul. In the Brit Chadashah, he's like, what can you add to your salvation? What do you think you can add? Nothing. But you do have to go to work on the 8th day. That seems to be part of the message that some of our brothers and sisters have missed. Don't confuse your salvation as something self-made. But in terms of working for your Creator, for letting yourself be taught according to that which he has already established, yes. But what stands between you and your Creator's work? Your creativity and his creativity is the 7th day, and you don't violate that boundary. You don't work on the 7th day. Don't do it. Unless you're in a life-preserving occupation. You don't do commerce. You don't do work on the Shabbat. Because if you're doing that, you're telling the world that you're divine. You're God. I created this world. And no, you didn't. Your work starts on the 8th day. And so how do we attain holiness? We protect the divine boundaries. If we can't protect the boundaries, we didn't protect the serpent from coming in and teaching something different, then we get kicked out. All right. We can't stay in that boundary because that boundary is holy and it would kill us to stay in there. And you say, well, we're already dying. Yes, but we have hope of resurrection in this plan. So we really only had 3 commandments in the garden. Work it, which remember it translates to worship also, which we would associate with the 7th day. We guard it, we protect it, which also means protecting the boundary of the 7th day so that we'll know our place in the universe. And thirdly, do not eat. Now that's the tough one. People like both work and worship. They love it. It's enjoyable. The guarding part, less enjoyable, especially when you're talking about Shabbat and there's a big sale on Shabbat. And it's the once a year big Shabbat sale, right? Well, then it becomes a little bit harder to guard the boundaries of Shabbat. But when you get into do not eat, you've got a war on your hands. And so that's the same thing that happened in the garden when people heard do not eat, and they did. We still fight that battle today when we're trying to follow what the word says and we don't eat that, but then our friends say, well, we're free to eat that now. And there we go. We've got the battle started. In fact, though, Israel is told, don't even prepare food on this day. Only prepare on the 6 days ahead and then enjoy it on the 7th day. You don't turn on the oven. You don't turn on the stove. You don't go out to the garden and get you a crate full of, taters and apples or whatever it is. No, you got 6 days to do that. And so you enjoy those things on the 7th day because you're not God. And that's easy. If you just put it that way, isn't that easy to deal with? If people ask you, well, why don't you do this on the 7th day? You just say, well, I'm not God. That's why. My work day starts on the 8th day. which to us would be Sunday. Here's something that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote, and I thought it was really wonderful. He has so many great quotable quotes. He says, when the first two human beings ate of the forbidden fruit, the essential harmony between man and nature was broken. Humanity lost its innocence. For the first time, nature, which is the world we find, the one that was created for us, and culture, which is the world we make, came into conflict. The result was paradise lost. And so culture is the world that we do make for ourselves. And so imagine, well, you don't have to imagine. You've probably been watching the news. If we know that a lot of these viruses are coming out of these wet markets where animals are not being treated according to the rules of this Torah portion, because it's a cultural thing, it's a world that has been made by a particular culture, then you're not going to just walk in there and say, okay, shut this all down. You're fighting a man-made culture. You're fighting God, man as God. Man who believes he has the power to set the new rules for himself according to what is eaten and how it's treated. And so when we go back and we start respecting the world that we found that was prepared for us, then we will start coming into conflict with culture. It may not be food, but it frequently is food. If you're trying to eat a clean diet, if you're just trying to bring the things into the tabernacle that are approved in the word, then you'll probably even come into conflict with your believing friends who have a culture of something different, but it's man-made. It's not supported by scripture. And again, if you go to those Becky books, Dr. Robin Gold's got some great booklets that show you how to handle these issues of clean eating, even, with Christians, with other believers who might not think that applies to them. It's worth a few bucks, but not on Shabbat, to seek that out. But there's also this tradition, and this is wonderful. Well, it wasn't for Adam and Eve, but there's a tradition that when Adam and Eve were sent from the garden, they were given an extra day. And they say that extra day they were given was a Shabbat. And that at the end, something they had always enjoyed, something they had always taken for granted that was there began to fade. And that something was the celestial light. Remember the light from the first day of creation? The plants were already growing by that light, not by the light of the sun and the moon and the stars. That was the fourth day. And so as the Shabbat is going out, the light starts fading for them for the first time. And they were very frightened. Imagine when you were a kid, when the lights went completely out and you weren't sure what was out there. Imagine how terrifying that would have been to them. It was fine for there to be sun, moon, and stars, that sort of day and night, but for the celestial light to fade was a completely new experience. So they were terrified. And the tradition is it was that point that Elohim comes in and he teaches them how to make fire by striking two stones together so that they wouldn't be afraid of the darkness that they had to, they had to now go into this fallen world, a nature of separation from the presence that they had enjoyed. But from then on, they could make a natural fire, even though they wouldn't have the benefit of the celestial light, of the celestial fire. And that particular tradition, it's embedded into discussions about this ceremony called Havdalah. Some of you may do Havdalah, but you do it at the end of Shabbat. You light a candle, you smell some sweet spices to remind you how wonderful the Shabbat was. You make a blessing over a glass of wine or grape juice. And what do? You put the light of the candle out in the grape juice, and that marks a distinction for you. Now you can go on about your 8th day. Now you can go on about your human creativity, and you won't be tempted to confuse your creativity with that which is divine. You say, from here on out, I am going to be creative. I'm going to do, I'm going to work, I'm going to guard. But it's going to be according to the way that he has taught me, not according to my own rules, but according to how he is teaching me to make light in the earth. So on Shabbat, we celebrate the celestial light. But on the 8th day, we celebrate this gift of light that we can make in the kingdom. And Yeshua used that analogy. He says, I'm the light of the world. And he says, you're the light of the world. If you have the word in you, then you can be the light of the world in the kingdom. And so what we make from that gift of light, again, it's a gift of good gold that we can give back to the creator of the most holy light. And if you say, well, that's a crazy tradition, look at Revelation 21:21. It says the 12 gates were 12 pearls, and each one of the gates was a single pearl. And the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. Okay, pure gold. Remember, inside the Garden of Eden, it says there was good gold, which we know is a prophecy of a people. We covered that, I think, week before last. He says, I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its temple. And the city has no need of the sun or of the moon to shine on it, for the glory, the kavod of God has illumined it, and its lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it in the daytime, for there will be no night there, but there's still a daytime. See how it's like the creation? Its gates will never be closed. And they will bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it. And nothing unclean, and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. So is it still important in the book of Revelation for you to know the difference between what is clean and unclean, what is abominable and what is not abominable? To know what is true and what is not true? Yes, it's still important. There's no idle words. But we can see the goal is to get back to that garden condition to where we can enjoy the celestial light and not have to rely on the natural light. And, it says the glory, the kavod of God has illumined it. That's exactly what happens in our Mishkan. In this Torah portion, the supernatural celestial fire comes down, illuminates everything. That's what he's giving us a taste of what we're going back to. He says the temple. You don't need a temple, because the whole point was for you to be able to walk with him, to walk in his glory once again. And it says the nations will walk by its light. You see, there's a restoration. The kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. So again, it's the light we make on the 8th day. It's the light he makes up through the 7th day. That's what's important. So if you see the nations and the kings of the earth bringing their glory and their honor into the holy city at that time, it tells us that they have figured out they're not God or monkeys or whatever it is that they believe they are, other than made in the image of Elohim and made to keep his commandments, to obey him so that his glory can come down. Because if you can't obey him, how will his glory come? That's the pattern that Moses gave us. You do what he's commanded, his glory will come down, and he will dwell among you. And it's interesting there, it says the gates will never be closed. It's not like the Garden of Eden where the gates close behind them. There's no question at this point that they know how to behave responsibly with the holy boundaries. So with the tabernacle, we have the same pattern. 7 days had to be completed so that the glory could descend upon it. That glory descended with obedience. Like Moses said, you've done what he commanded, now the glory is going to come down. There has to be agreement between the two of us. So in the 7 days, the natural world was created and crowned with the holiness of Shabbat. We can't add anything to those 7 days, but we can do what he has prepared for us to do, beginning with the 8th day. And that's when we have the sign of the covenant in the flesh, the circumcision. Because when an Israelite boy was circumcised, that was a message that this child is going to be brought up in the commandments. He's going to be able to differentiate between what is out in the world, those who don't know how to respect boundaries, those who don't know how to preserve boundaries and holiness, those who don't know how to eat. He's keeping that covenant as a sign that he does know the difference between the 7th day and the 8th day. And so basically the 8th day is seen as the human counterpart to the first day of divine creation. He starts his work on the first day. We start our work on the 8th day. So we've got this little miniature universe that's being erected in the tabernacle. And he's showing them there's no reason to be afraid of the darkness. He says, you don't even have to rub 2 sticks or 2 stones together in the Mishkan. If you will obey me, then you'll always have this light of the celestial fire. That light will always be on the altar for you. And I'm going to teach you how to make light in the earth. Moses is going to teach you my statutes and my commandments. His fire and his glory come down to the altar. And he's showing them, how does the fire and the glory come down? Through holiness. Knowing what his boundaries are, respecting his boundaries, obeying his boundaries, and then the glory and the fire come down. They had to be able to let Elohim be their heavy presence. Remember, glory kavod is kaved, which is heavy. And that's why we associate it, again, with this COVID virus. It's the same Hebrew root letters. And the liver, remember Pharaoh's livered heart, his hard heart. And ironically, the month of Tevet, when this coronavirus or COVID-19 was isolated, kaved, it's the liver. It's associated with the heaviness of the liver that went on the altar. So these livers and these kidneys had to go on the altar in obedience before the glory of the kavod would come down. So we have to decide that Elohim is the heavy in this agreement and in this relationship. We don't get to make up our own rules. We get to be creative with his rules and to build on what he's teaching us to do by commandment. And so if we're going to prepare for the garden, it even means respecting the Father's divine instructions on what to eat, what not to eat, how to prepare it, when to prepare it. It's not always logical, but it is holy. And that's something you can tell people. Eating according to the Bible isn't supposed to be logical. It's supposed to be holy. It's not supposed to be something understood by human philosophy or human understanding. It's supposed to be engaged with faith. Because if it's based on philosophy or science or logic and reason, how could it possibly be faith? So let's look at Leviticus 11:44. I want you to look at 12 things. I'm going to give you some twin passages. Leviticus 11:44. I want you to listen for separation words and holy words. He says, for I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. And you shall not make yourselves unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth. For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy. Basically, he says, because that's why. I brought you out of the realm of death. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's why I'm giving you these dietary laws. He didn't give them the dietary laws in Egypt. He gave them the dietary laws when he got them out of that realm of dead things. Once he brings you out of the realm of dead things, he says, now I'm going to teach you holiness. And he says, this is the law regarding the animal and the bird and every living thing that moves in the waters and everything that swarms on the earth, to make a distinction, lehavdil, to separate. So Havdalah means, it means to separate between the clean and the between the unclean and the clean, and between the edible creature and the creature which is not to be eaten. Remember, only 3 rules in the garden, right? Work, worship, guard, do not eat, right? These things you can eat, these things you can't eat. Now that passage, you heard holy, holy, consecrate. Consecrate is the same Hebrew word, kadash. Consecrate, holy, 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 holy. 5 holies. And a lehavdil, a separation. Now let's look at Leviticus 20:24. Moreover, you shall not follow the customs of the nation which I will drive out before you, for they did all these things, and therefore I have abhorred them. Hence I have said to you, you are to possess their land, and I myself will give it to you to possess it, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has separated you from the peoples. Okay, he said the same thing here, a different way. Back in the other passage, he says, I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God, thus you shall be holy. I took you out of the realm of the death, out of the realm of death. I'm holy, so this is why I want you to eat this way. Now, in the second passage where he's talking about the foods, he says, it's because I am the Lord your God who has separated you from the peoples. The things that they ate are not the things I want you to eat. He says, you are therefore to make distinction between the clean animal and the unclean. Why? Why do you have to do that? Why do you have to figure it? Why do you have to go in Kroger or wherever, K. Rogers, and read the label and make sure there's nothing in there that's creepy crawly, something in his abhorrent list? You have to do that because he separated you from the peoples. That's simple. You have to do that because he's holy. You are therefore, he says, that's why. This is why you have to make a distinction between the clean animal and the unclean, because I've separated you from the peoples. Between the unclean bird and the clean, and you shall not make yourselves detestable by animal or by bird or by anything that creeps on the ground, which I have separated for you as unclean. Thus you are to be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the peoples to be mine. So he repeats himself. Separation, make a distinction, separated for you, I've set you apart. Right? You hear those additional separations in this twin passage. And then he says, thus you are to be holy, for I, the Lord, am holy. That's 2 more holies. So now we have all the reasons in the world we need to make a distinction between a clean and an unclean animal that we would consider food. So the root word kadash for holy is used 7 times in those 2 passages. And some form of the verb lehavdil for separate or to make distinct is used 5 times. So there's 7 holies and 5 separations mandated to 12 tribes. 7 plus 5 is still 12. And what does this do? It teaches them how to be holy to their Creator, to make the distinction, to guard the boundaries, and so that they can distinguish between what they teach themselves about food and what Elohim has taught them about food through his word. And the animals that are not permitted to us, they lack distinction. For instance, amphibians. Are they water creatures or are they land creatures? There's no distinction. They're a little confused. Same thing with the creatures who don't have fins and scales. It's a mixed message. Like a whale can be a mammal because it doesn't have the scales. Our land animals tend to be predators. But like a pig, it sends a mixed message. On the outside, it has the cloven hoof. So on the outside, it looks all holy. But it's a hypocrite because inside, it does not have the extra stomachs. It's not a ruminant. And so it's not going to chew the cud. And so again, a great message to us. Don't be a hypocrite. Don't try to look holy on the outside when you're not holy on the inside. And again, it's not logic. Holiness is illogical. But it does require faith in a creator. So if we look at Peter's vision of what's clean and what's unclean, and how all those animals are mixed in there together, he's showing us a picture of a greater plan of how the kings and the nations of the earth can be taught to bring their glory into the holy city. And again, that book, Peter's Vision, Beacon or Bacon, it is worth it to go through it. She's even got a great chart at the back of the book, if you're not familiar with those types of animals that are kosher or clean, holy for us to eat. But how we leave Babylon is through holiness. How we left Egypt was through a divine miracle salvation. But how we're going to leave Babylon, you can't have read Revelation and not get this, by the way. How you're going to leave Babylon is through your holiness, doing what Moses commanded you to do. Obeying the word. That's how holiness is attained, through progressive obedience, letting him teach you his word. And this is a message to a saved people. Leviticus is not a message to an unsaved people. It's to a saved people. Now that they have escaped this realm where Pharaoh worships himself and his own will and his servants who worship him, now they're going to have to learn how to serve a true creator. They're going to have to reestablish holiness in the camp in order to understand the light that would guide the way back to the garden. And so the Mishkan was that little opportunity there to start practicing. It was garden practice. And then something happens that just ruins the glory of the day, at least for Aaron and Moses. We know that Nadab and Abihu got caught up in a spiritual ecstasy. They put incense on their censers and thought they would go into the holy place and experience that spiritual ecstasy. And you say, well, that's not a bad thing to want to be close to the presence of Elohim. But it was a mistake. See, it was their father Aaron who was supposed to offer the incense in the holy place, and they rushed out ahead of him. You say, but it was for a good purpose. You know, they really loved God and they really wanted to be close to him. Yes, but they were leaders. They were priests. They had a great obligation to know the rules of holiness and to abide by them and not to usurp their father's authority. And that's a mistake that goes all the way back to the garden. If you think about it, when the serpent comes in and tells Eve, well, if you eat this, you'll be wise like God, she might have thought about, oh, wow, you know, to experience that spiritual ecstasy of wisdom. This has to be the right thing to do. It's going to make me more like him. Doesn't he say I'm made in his image? And that subtle twisting and replacing obedience with that reaching for spiritual ecstasy before your time, out of time. We can confuse our will with Elohim's will. That's the seduction of the serpent. He wants you to confuse your will with Elohim's will. That's what you see, the harlot riding the scarlet beast in Revelation. It's the same scenario. She's riding the beast of her own desire. She's wanting that spiritual ecstasy over obedience. And so if you want to experience the kavod, the kaved, this heaviness of the glory, then it requires sacrifice. And what has to be sacrificed is your will. What you think is obedience. What you think is required. You have to replace what you think with what he thinks. And he didn't make it hard to figure out. He actually wrote it down in a book for us. So even if your desired outcome is a spiritual one, it also has to be through obedience. Just like Eve, she wants more spiritual wisdom. Nadav, he wants to experience this ecstasy of the spirit world. But see, if it's prohibited in the word and you know it, it will destroy your earthly vessel. You will experience that fire, but see, you won't be ready to experience it because it will find you in a state of disobedience. It's that heavy. I mean, one of my favorite songs is that song, "Let the Weight of Your Glory Cover Me." Well, you got to really think about that song before you just start singing it. Remember, sacrifices preceded the glory. You need to think about, is there anything that's unrepented in my life? Do I need to ask forgiveness? Do I have everything in order in my life before I go rushing into his presence or asking for that presence to cover me? You have to really think and consider your spiritual life and whether you have sacrificed for that relationship to even request that his glory cover you. Because if you're doing it without obedience, if you're doing something you know is wrong and you're thinking, well, I just want to be close to him, he'll accept me anyway, rethink that one. Now, if you're a child, if you don't know any better, I think he gives you a lot of grace. And that's our prayer. May he please disregard our childishness when we request things from him that would kill us if he actually did what we asked him to do. Some of the greatest acts of mercy are unanswered prayers. But leaders do have a higher accountability. So while we might make these unwitting requests that as a father, he knows better than to give us what we're asking for, the more you understand, the more accountability you have, and therefore the higher the danger zone. That if you make a mistake out of willful disobedience or mistaking your will for his in a position of authority, then the fire could break out on you. And it doesn't mean you go to hell. It means that your physical body could not stand in that place. And Nadav's name, it means willingly eager. And that's how we promote that in praise and worship, being willingly eager. But we also have to be willingly responsible and obedient to enter into his presence, not to confuse our will with his will. There's an irreverence there. There's a presumptuousness there. And holiness means I know the boundaries and I observe the boundaries. And the twin passage that comes in the Havdalah portion this week, remember, was from 2 Samuel. It's when they're bringing the ox cart, and they knew better than to put the Ark of the Covenant in an ox cart. It was expressly forbidden, but the priests do it. And once they reach the threshing floor of Nachon, the ox stumbles, Uzzah reaches out, Uzzah means power, but it's human power. He reaches out with human power to steady the ark, and he's burned up just like Nadab was. And David becomes angry. See, Nachon means truth. They reach the threshing floor of truth. And we can run around and we can have our praise and worship services knowing we're living lives of disobedience, willful disobedience, not childish, not unwitting. We're living lives of willful disobedience. We're not repenting of our sins. We can rush around with tambourines and electric guitars or whatever we want, singing, "Let the weight of your glory cover me," but that's probably the last thing you want to happen. But if we come with humility, saying, "Father, forgive me," if we come with sacrifices of our self-will, if we come with offerings of peace, then I think we're on a better track to experience his glory. So I'm going to mention a few things. This is what I said at the beginning of the stream. Don't write this down as gospel or something. It's just some things I'm thinking about. And I'm going to look some more at the dates probably over the next week or so. Remember, kavod is glory. But it can also mean like the kaved, the liver. And in last week's lesson, we saw how Pharaoh got a livered heart. In other words, he got a hard heart. So if your heart is hardened to Adonai, then there comes a certain point, well, he will harden your heart for you. He'll give you exactly what you want, a livered heart, a hard heart. And so there's two aspects. There's the glory, there's the divine presence, and then those who are going to be separated from it because they're too full of themselves. They're too heavy with their own glory. They're not like in Revelation where it says the kings and the nations will bring their glory into the holy city. That's what he's looking for. Negate your own glory, and whatever you have, whatever you can create in his image, bring that into him. Give that gift back to him. We know that this COVID was isolated on the 10th of Tevet, January 7th, 2020. And that's the fast of the 10th month because it's based on when the siege was initiated against Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, here's where it gets interesting. There's two interpretations of how long that siege lasted. One says it lasted 18 months. And by the way, 18 is a number of freedom. It's if something's had you imprisoned, quarantined, or whatever, when we see the number 18, that was actually the first book I ever wrote, was Standing with Israel, and it's based on that number 18 and the examples of freedom. Got it in Spanish too. Showing you how it's a scriptural pattern. You can be held captive 17, but in the 18th, you go free. If the siege was 18 months, there's one outcome. Other interpretations say it was 30 months, and there's some ambiguity in the scripture, and the scholars believe it's because they're calculating two different ways. One with Nisan as the first of the months, and then the other with Tishrei, the 7th month, as being the first, because it's talking about the rule of kings. And so there's some disparity there, but I think, well, what if it's not certainly not a mistake, but what if it's ambiguous on purpose? Because both of those dates are meaningful. And when we looked at Shabbat Haggadah, we looked at its twin that falls between Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, and then Yom Kippur, that Shabbat Shuvah, the Shabbat of return. So having these book-ended calculations saying, was it this one, was it this one? That's interesting, because if it's 18 months of siege, then 18 is a number of freedom. If we calculate out 12 months, 1 year, from the 10th of Tevet, this year it would actually fall on December 25th. So if the destruction began on the 10th of Tevet, which was January 1st this year, then it will, a year out will be another day of destruction, which is December the 25th. And then again, if we add on, and by the way, that Torah portion would be Vayigash, which is important in terms of Joseph drawing near to his brothers. But if we calculate out the full 18 months from January 7th, we come to June 20th, which would be 2021, which comes out to be the 10th of Tammuz, which is Parashat Balak. If you calculate it out at 30 months, again, it's falling on some weird fast days. And if you want to go look those up on the Hebrew calendar, you can. I'm going to work on those this week. But it seems like no matter what you do with the start date of COVID-19, where it would end based on Ezekiel's prophecy, whether it's going to be the 18 months or the 30 months, it's going to fall on significant days in the Jewish calendar. All right, let's go on to Ezekiel. Ezekiel 24, by the way, if you didn't tune in last week. We know that embedded in Ezekiel 24 is this prophecy of a boiling pot. And if you want to turn there and take a look, just scan down through there at the steps that Ezekiel prophesies. We're supposed to understand that by first telling Ezekiel to put water in the pot before he starts adding the pieces, that he's slowing down the siege. In other words, he doesn't want Jerusalem to fall in a day or a month or a year. He wants it to be a slow burn. Nadav and Avihu, fast. They step straight into the glory and straight to their deaths. Same thing with Uzzah. But with this siege of Jerusalem by Babylon, which is significant, remember, we're talking about getting out of the uncleanness of Babylon. That's what affects this generation. The gospel has pretty much been preached around the earth. Most people have at least once heard a message of salvation. But we're out here in Babylon. We're still out here in confusion with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And on any given day, we're absorbing way more of Babylon than we're soaking of the light out into that world. But we have, again, these 4 points, these 4 altar judgments. Kavod, it's either the glory or the hardened heart. These 4 altar judgments are going to come out of fire. From those 4 are going to come all the judgments. So we've got a choice. We've got glory, kavod, or we've got death, which again is the delivered heart. Ezekiel's prophecy is of a slow boil. And I think you could even see that in terms of Pharaoh. Think of how long it took those 10 plagues to run their cycle. It was kind of a slow boil. Ezekiel 24 describes several objects or things. He talks about the impending siege by Babylon. He talks about the fall and the exile of Jerusalem. But there's specific things, a metal pot, not an earthen pot, a metal pot, because remember, a metal pot can be salvaged. An earthen pot has to be broken. So there's still hope for a metal pot, that you could get the uncleanness if you passed it through the fire. You could get it out of there. He talks about water, which remember is what's making the siege last so long. It's a slow process of the altar judgments. He talks about wood. putting the wood on the fire. He talks about the torches. He talks about the different cuts of the flesh, both normal cuts and then the choicest of cuts. In other words, they all go in there together. So no matter how, rich and famous you were, or how poor and infamous you were going to boil in the same pot. And then Ezekiel is told to shafut the pot. In other words, he says, I want you to do these things in a distinct order. That water being the primary thing. Slow this thing down. Slow down the heating. And then he mentions something specific. He says, the reason this is happening, it's because Jerusalem has left blood on a smooth rock. In other words, they have no shame over the blood that has been shed. It has become a culture. Remember, culture is what we make. Nature is what we find. Culture is what we make. They have made a morally accepted culture of despising lifeblood. So look at our world around us. What are all the ways that we are shedding lifeblood shamelessly? In other words, we've lost the ability to even be ashamed of the blood that we're shedding. Whether we're talking about abortion, whether we're talking about people thinking it's okay to grab 6 30-round clips and walk into a public place and empty the clips and kill as many people as they possibly can and then kill themselves shamelessly with no thought as to what this would do to the family or anyone left behind, much less what their eternity would be like. There's no shame in the shedding of blood. And so he says, this is the problem, and this is why the judgment is coming. You're not only shedding blood, you're not even ashamed of it. You're promoting it. You're proud of it. It's something you're proud of. So these people that want to go out and gun down hundreds, they're proud of the ability to do that. They want to be famous that way. They want their name in the news, even if they're dead. Now, what kind of stupidity other than supernaturally imposed could that be? They've become stupid. That's what a livered heart does. It makes you thick and stupid when it comes to spiritual things. And so, you have people marching for the right to shed blood. So that's the smooth rock. That's how the rabbis are interpreting that. They're not even trying to cover up the blood anymore. When you do your sin and do it in secret, that's one thing. But when you're proud of it, when you want it in the news, he says, this is what's bringing on this destruction of Jerusalem. I'm going to destroy your temple. Anything that was dear to you, I'm going to destroy. So he says, arrange these bones in the fire in verse 5. And this is seen as the blood and the bones of the martyrs. People who mourned for the blood that was shed. People who stood against the blood that was shed, and then their own blood was added to that. People who have self-sacrificed for the sake of the gospel, self-sacrificed for the sake of the word. And again, that makes you think of the souls under the altar in Revelation saying, how long, O Lord, until our blood is avenged in the earth? How long can the earth continue shamelessly shedding blood? Verse 6 says, put it cut by cut into an empty pot. All that's going to be in there is this water to slow down the boil. And this is going to be seen again, this cut by cut. He puts the flesh and the bones in there, and then he takes it out one by one, by one, by one. The rabbis say this is the different groups of people that went out and surrendered during the siege. And what did they do? They went into captivity. They went into captivity. They went into captivity. They went into captivity. The king and his soldiers tried to escape. and they were caught in the plains of Jericho. There was no escape. There was no place to go. Once the siege had started, there was no place to go. Verse 10, he says, pile up the fire. Now increase the heat on it. As time goes on, increase the heat. He says, because there's filth that I can only get to. There's this junk in your heart. I'm only going to be able to purge it out if I really turn the heat up. And so what was the point of the siege? To cleanse the abominations out of them. What do you think it's going to take the world to realize that we don't treat animals this way? We don't put these things in our mouths. We don't mistake our special days for his days. That we don't work on Shabbat because we're not God. Our work starts on the 8th day. What's it going to take? Because these things are cultural. They've been ingrained for thousands of years. What will it take to get that filth out so he can clean up the pot? It's going to take a lot of fire. Verse 12 describes how their power is going to weaken. And he says, in the process, I'm going to weaken their falsehood, their lies. The world is full of lies. There are cultures who think lying is an art form if it accomplishes the purpose. Again, there's no shame in lying. There's only shame in not doing it well. Verse 13, he says, it's because of your lewdness. In that Hebrew word, there is tameh. Remember in Leviticus, we're talking about what is clean and unclean. He says, these things are an abomination for you. These things are unclean. They're not to be eaten. It's tameh. It's not ritually pure. You can't do this in the garden. And he says, it's because you've refused my holiness. I taught you my ways of holiness and you refused it. So how can you be a light to the nations where they could ever learn how to bring their glory and honor into the holy city? You're out there doing just what they do. He says, it's only my fury that's going to clean you up. And then that chapter is going to conclude with Ezekiel losing what is most precious to him. He says, your most precious thing. I'm going to take your wife. Your wife is going to die. And he says, this death is going to symbolize Jerusalem. And he says, what I'm not going to allow you to do as a sign to Jerusalem of what's coming, that I'm going to take what is most precious from them. I'm going to take their city and I'm going to take their temple. He says, I'm not going to let you perform the mourning rituals. And mourning rituals are important in Scripture. And if you'll remember, because he still had the holy oil on him, Aaron was not permitted to mourn Nadav and Abihu. And so again, this idea of the fire. A people who are called to glory, but then think they can have disobedience and have their temple in the same city? No, you don't get to do that. Nadav and Abihu, they can have the glory and disobedience in the same location? No, you don't get to do that. And he says, and you're not even going to get to perform your mourning rituals. You're not going to be able to grieve properly. Well, I pulled this article up on April 14th. And it says, it's by David Arrow on Fox News. It says, coronavirus may have spread from dead body. The news on possible infections from dead bodies comes as relatives of the deceased have been advised not to touch or kiss bodies of their loved ones. And this is why I pulled this quote up, which has impacted funeral or death rituals in countries throughout the world. So he says, I'm going to take what's most precious to you, and you're not going to be able to mourn. You're not going to be able to go through those rituals. And that language is going to remind us of another case where people were not allowed to mourn. And again, if this may not sound familiar to some of you, we cover a lot of this stuff in our online classes. I think there's a little bit about it in 50,000 Degrees and Cloudy. But it's examination of the text that describes the death of Miriam and the rabbinic reading of that text without some of the artificial breaks that we tend to put into a translation, where it says, Miriam died and the community was without water. And they see it as one statement, that because Miriam was a prophetess and that she led in praise and worship, it says all the women followed her, that she was seen as like a mother to the tribes, a leader. And that's what it says later. He says, I sent Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to lead you, to go before you. And she dies. And even though we see Aaron and Moses were given 30 days, the people were given 30 days to mourn for them, you don't see that with Miriam. It just says she died, she's buried, there's no water. The water's cut off when Miriam dies. And so the people start complaining that there's no water. And the way that they're reading that is it says that the people were not allowed to mourn properly. And when you're not allowed to mourn properly, it has adverse consequences. You start to act out in ways you don't even understand if you've not been allowed a proper mourning, not just ritual, but period and recognition of what's happening to your soul, the separation of your soul from these other souls. So instead of understanding that the people are grieving and they're not complaining in exactly the same way as they've complained about other things, Moses gets upset and he confuses his will with God's will. And he calls them a bunch of rebels. In Numbers 20:10, it says, Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. And he said to them, listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? So number one, he confuses his will with the Father's will, his anger with the Father's anger. He gathers the assembly, which we know is a danger warning. Whenever the first mention of the assembly is at the assembly of the golden calf. So when you see that word assembly, you better watch out. And then we see the 7 assemblies at the beginning of Revelation. Better watch out is the warning. So he gathers the assembly. That's 2 usages of kahal for assembly. So right there, he should be thinking, danger, danger, danger. And he says, listen, you rebels. And that was not what the Father wanted to hear, because it wasn't exactly accurate. He calls them Hamorim, you rebels. The root word for rebel is in Miriam's name, by the way. It's almost saying, you followers of Miriam, you complainers. But in that root word, you hear maror, the same root word for maror, the bitter herbs of Passover, but also more for the frankincense and the myrrh, specifically myrrh, which was an ancient burial spice. So our question is, was Moses acting in righteous anger and indignation when they complained about the water? At that point, he experienced a little bit of liver in his heart. There was a little bit of his own heaviness, a little bit of his own self-importance, because you heard that in the wording. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? Well, they weren't going to bring forth any water. It was always going to be the Holy One. But remember, until the liver's put on the altar, the glory is not going to come down on the 8th day. We have to put aside self-will and quit making our self-will his will, because we're not that heavy. We only think we're that heavy. We can't put self-will or spiritual ecstasy ahead of respect for the Father, because it's out of place and it's out of bounds. And that's exactly what Moses is told. He says, you did not sanctify my name as holy. You sanctified your name as holy. And that's what can happen. Sometimes we get an addiction to a spiritual ecstasy, and it will mask a spiritually hardened liver. Now, in Moses' case, I would say this was a one-time deal. But that shows you how heavy a price he paid. It's important not to become angry and resentful in this process where we're learning obedience to his will, because the people who will test us are the people. It's not like, Yeshua's going to knock on your front door and say, okay, today's your test day. You have to understand that whoever knocks on your door that day could be your test today. And you can't become resentful of that. You can't become resentful of people, even though it's very tempting to become resentful of the people when they test you day after day after day. And you think their only role in life is to prevent you from enjoying spiritual ecstasy and the glory. That is their role, is to test you, not to prevent you, but to test you and to show you areas where you need to change. And say, this was not the Father's will, this was my self-will. The Father is not as angry about this as I am. The Father is not as offended over this as I am. I need to be careful and not confuse my anger with his, because he has a lot of grace and mercy. And it's best to let him reach the end of that mercy wherever he wants to, and be more concerned about, has he ever reached it, the end of it with us, when we knew better and rebelled. Because you see, it was actually Moses and Aaron who rebelled by not sanctifying his name as holy. They didn't do what he told them to do with the rock. And the rock there is Selah. Ironically, the smooth rock covered with shameless blood in Ezekiel's prophecy of the 10th of Tevet, Selah. So calling forth that water for Moses it brought on a slow death, where probably every single day for the rest of his life, he thought about the consequences for substituting his will for the Father's. He didn't die like Nadav and Avihu, just crispy critters like that. It was a slow boil, just like Ezekiel's talking about, because he did not sanctify the name as holy. And people ask me, why don't we see these great miracles of the apostles? Why don't we raise people from the dead anymore? Why don't we do this? Why don't we see the signs and the wonders? And maybe the answer is the Father's protecting us from our own arrogance. Maybe if we started operating in that sort of power, one little mistake would kill us. Because we would be tempted to start substituting our own anger, our own rebellion, our own glory for the Father's. And it's an act of mercy. And he is going to restore those things in his time. But it's better not to have them and to use them sinfully and rebelliously. We have to be careful about the types of spiritual ecstasy that we're craving and the conclusions that we draw about it. But not declaring that period of mourning, not allowing the people to mourn for Miriam, we see that parallel. We can see it with Ezekiel. I'm not going to allow you to mourn your wife. The same way the people of Jerusalem, they're not going to be able to go through these periods of mourning, because they're going to start dropping like flies under the siege. And we know it became pretty horrible. Under the siege, they even became cannibalistic. Talk about not performing a mourning ritual. The rock was actually the witness to self-deception. In the case of Moses and Aaron, in the case of the Jerusalemites. The rock was the witness. So we've got this slow boil of judgments that started on the 10th of Tevet according to this cycle. Now, is this the cycle to end all cycles, or is this just the cycle to wake us up in our generation? We're not told, because these prophecies do go in their cycles. The siege, it says, spanned 3 years of the king. And through the siege, they had all 4 altar judgments. Remember Ezekiel's fire? The 4 altar judgments come from the fire. The plague, the sword, the famine or hunger, and the wild beast. Those started burning Jerusalem from within, and there was no escape. If you tried to escape, you would be captured. And it's the result of shamelessness for sin, for not mourning our sin. It says in Ezekiel 24:8, for her blood is in her midst. She placed it on the bare rock. She did not pour it on the ground to cover it with dust, that it may cause wrath to come up to take vengeance. I have put her blood on the bare rock, that it may not be covered. So not covering the blood, which is respect for the blood and respect for the instructions concerning blood in his word, rebelling against that, and even taking pride, being shameless and mournless over death, shameless and mournless over sin. He says, I'm going to judge it with fire, and he says it's going to cause the wrath to come up. So we talk about the wrath of the Lamb. What's the Lamb upset about? He's upset that we're not upset over sin. And he says, we can tell that we're due the wrath because we will see cultures come to the place where they don't even mourn over death anymore. It's just another story on the evening news. Well, that's too bad. But we're not really that upset about it. So if I would recommend you go back and look again at Ezekiel 24. Look at those contexts. Maybe work a little bit with the dates, because you have to go back into 2 Kings and look at the progression and the siege of Jerusalem by Babylon. But here's what Ezekiel was told. Let's see, what verse is this? Starting with verse 15, it says, the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, behold, I'm about to take from you the desire of your eyes with a blow. But you shall not mourn, and you shall not weep, and your tears shall not come. Groan silently, make no mourning for the dead. Bind on your turban, put your shoes on your feet, do not cover your mustache, and do not eat the bread of men. In other words, nobody's going to be able to come over to your house and bring you food like is normally done in a mourning ritual for at least 7 days. When you're in a state of mourning within Judaism, you don't prepare your own meals. People come over and they take care of that for you. He says, you're not even, this quarantine is going to be to such an extent that when you lose the thing dearest to you, you're not even going to be able to have people over to comfort you, to bring you food and so forth. That word there for the blow that he's about to put on Ezekiel's wife, who remember is the sign of Jerusalem. It's magifah, and it means a plague, a pestilence, or a strike. And that's what he says. I'm about to take from you the desire of your eyes with a blow, with a magifah. But you shall not mourn, you shall not weep, your tears shall not come. That's the plague, that's the pestilence. I'm going to take what you desire with a plague. And you're not going to be able to mourn properly, because this plague is a warning of a slow burn. He's put the pot on the fire. He's put the water in the pot. He's putting the people in the pot because there's blood on a smooth rock. We can't continue mingling. See, holiness is separation. Distinction between clean and unclean. Distinction between what is abominable and not abominable. distinction between Shabbat and the other 6 days of the week, distinction between what the Creator has done and what he teaches us to create, beginning on the 8th day. And so he's not going to allow us to continue mingling all the lies that are going into the earth indefinitely. He's not going to allow the manipulations of power to go on indefinitely. He's not going to allow people of faith to continue devouring one another indefinitely. He's not going to allow us to continue shouting for glory while we're in shameless disobedience to his word. He's not going to allow us to continue passing off our will and our emotions as his will and his emotions. He's not going to allow us to continue worshiping our own appetites, desires, and intellect. You know, I doubt if he wants to hear one more God bless America by people unwilling to give him the obedience of God. If he's God, if he's Elohim, if he's the creator of the universe, then serve him. If not, then continue serving yourself and go ahead and jump in the pot. This plague, according to Ezekiel, could be the beginning of just a slow siege. There could be something significant at the end of 18 months if you count from the 10th of Tevet, which was January the 7th. And you would need to count by a Hebrew calendar, not by a Gregorian. Or it could be a 30-month. Both could be simultaneously true. It may have been an intentional bookending. There's a Psalm 65. It's a Psalm of David. It says, when he was in the wilderness of Judah, he says, "O God, you are my God. I shall seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you." Remember, the sword is one of the altar judgments. It means to make thirsty. It makes you thirsty, so you'll seek him earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you, in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Thus I have seen you in the sanctuary, the holy place, Bakodesh, to see you in your power, kavod, your glory, powers, uzcha. Like, remember Uzzah that touched the ark? He says, I want to see your power, uzcha, yours, not human power, your power and your glory, ukvodecha, your glory, not mine. Remember, the kings and the nations are going to bring their glory into the holy city. They're not going to be honor and glory vacuums like we are today. And if you look at humankind, that's basically what we are. Honor and glory vacuums and sponges. Why aren't people listening to me? Why aren't people watching me? Why don't I feel important? And I think it goes back to quit God bless America unless you're willing to obey him and sacrifice your honor and your glory to him. Because he says, when I'm in this dry place, he says, that's the only way I'm going to be able to recognize your power and your glory. And that's why he takes us to these dry places. He takes us to the wilderness to build a mishkan, so we'll understand his honor and his glory, so he can prepare us and teach us his commandments, so when the time comes that he can lift us up into that glory and dwell with us forever. He wants to take us to that place where we're not in the wilderness saying, shall we bring forth water for you? We have to treat his name as holy. And we have to be careful about running into the divine presence, demanding things, without bringing certain sacrifices of humility. So, on this end, I'm going to do a little more research into those dates. and see if we are on this particular cycle. I know that we end up on significant days on the Jewish calendar in terms of the fall of Jerusalem. And if this is in a reverse, if this is a rectification, we know that Jerusalem, yes, has been exiled out there among the nations. They've been exiled out there among confusion. But he says, come out of her, my people. Get out of that uncleanness. Quit absorbing the uncleanness of the world. Instead, you be a light to the world. And it could be that this siege is to release his people from the nations and to bring them back to one place. Rather than putting them under siege and exiling them, what we have to do is examine ourselves to see if we've left any blood on a smooth rock. If we become callous to sin, if we become callous to blood, if we become callous to sanctification, holiness, if we've been running around looking for spiritual ecstasy when he wanted us to start with obedience, because that takes a lot of humility. You don't feel much sometimes when you're obedient. But it's not about how you feel. It's about what is written. And if you're doing what's written, you're standing on a pretty solid rock, because you don't have to make water come out of the rock. He's going to make the water come out of the rock for you. And what does it say? I will give him some of the hidden manna, the manna that's hidden inside the ark. I'll give you some of that. So I haven't been able to read all the comments, but I'm going to go back through them later this afternoon, and my little way of connecting with you. But I'm so glad you all tuned in with us on this Shabbat. I apologize for the dog snoring, but it's better than the dog barking. I have one of those put you to sleep voices, apparently. But yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. And again, don't do it on Shabbat. But if you're looking for some of these resources, and I'm saying this because I've gotten some emails from you, if you're interested in the online Zoom classes we do on Monday or Tuesday, just email me at creationgospel@gmail.com. The 666 stuff, the 7 abominations of the wicked lamp, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, that's workbook 2. But I wish you wouldn't do it if you haven't done workbook 1. And you don't need to buy the book. We're on YouTube. You can find these videos on my channel, and it doesn't cost anything to watch them. And the playlist should be queued up in order. There's 17 programs. I would prefer you watch those 17 programs of workbook 1 before you get into workbook 2, because it's deep stuff. It's not that deep to me, but if you're not grounded in Torah portions, it's very deep. It should be the simplest thing in the world, and we're going to make it the simplest thing in the world, because you and I are going to start teaching this Torah to the nations. We're going to start spreading the light to the nations instead of absorbing their unclean junk. And again, if you want to know more about 18 as that number of freedom, it's this book, and I got this one in Spanish. The workbook 1's in Spanish. It's in French. If you know somebody that speaks French, it's in Kenya Rwandan. If you know somebody who lives in Rwanda, we have those versions too. But we want to make those resources available to you as much as we can. And so, again, stay the course. Don't be discouraged. But if you are mourning over the sin that you see around you in this world, then that's the good heart. That's this. We should be mourning over the blood on the smooth rock. And we're going to continue in prayer for you guys. that you would be in health, that this pestilence would not come near your house. But again, don't neglect the word at this time. If things kind of go back to normal, which I've said, don't long for normal. It may never be normal again. But if the pressure eases up, don't succumb to the temptation to replace the ground you've gained during this time in your prayer and your Bible study and let it dissipate out there in Babylon. You hang on to those boundaries of holiness that you have formed and are forming at this time. Don't turn loose of those. This is for a reason. And for those who are holy, he says, go on being holy. For those who are clean, go on being clean. For those who are unclean, go on being unclean. But I think there's still hope. I think we've got this slow boil. It gives us time to proclaim his word and his holiness. Don't ever be embarrassed or ashamed of eating kosher. Don't ever be embarrassed or ashamed of keeping his Shabbat. It's an honor. It's his honor. And it's his glory for us to keep it and to guard it and to do not eat those things, but to eat these things. His word is always honorable. It's never shameful. All right, guys, we got to go. But thanks so much for tuning in. As far as I know, we'll be back next week. And we'll just see as these states start to come up one by one. I think eventually we can start meeting with our congregation again. And so we probably won't be doing these live things so much. But again, if you want to be with us week by week in the Zoom Torah class, just email me. I'll put that in here. And that way I'll be there when you go back and look at the recording. But that's how you can get in touch with me. All right? Not ashamed. Don't be ashamed. Be blessed with his honor, with his glory, and trust me, all that spiritual ecstasy that we're longing for, that celestial light, it will return. We don't have to be scared of the dark. Love you guys.